Hello and welcome to PRICOM Design. Today we're going to go through some of the new features in our Dream Player MK2 and more specifically around the multi-random mode as well as the background track mode. These two modes are part of our firmware update starting at about version 1.5, most recently version 1.6. 1.6 gives you a lot of these features, and we just wanted to show you how that works so that there's a little bit more obvious how to use it and a little less confusion about what some of these terms and functionalities mean. So let's take a look. So first let's review our setup. We have our Dream Player MK2, a PRICOM button board. This is quite handy for attaching 4 push buttons with 4 LEDs to your Dream Player. These can be mounted in a panel. Terminal strips come out the back. We have our laptop with our SD card reader that allows us to edit our configuration file. And then we've got a power supply to power our Dream Player. We already did a video on how to use the config file, so if you want to see a more in-depth explanation of other parameters in the config file, you can see our other video. There's 3 things we're going to focus on today though in this video. First is this multi-random mode. What multi-random mode allows you to do, and this is only available on the MK2, it's not available on the Dream Player Lite. What the multi-random mode allows you to do is load up to 8 different tracks on each one of the trigger inputs. So what that means is you could have track number 1, and track number 1 could be 8 different files. So it could pick randomly, and it's really shuffling those files across that trigger input. But you could have different types of activities on each of those 4 triggers. So that's what the multi-random mode is about. We also have a new mode called background mode. And again, this is only available on the MK2, but what background mode does is it plays a background file, and it just keeps looping that background file, and when you get a trigger input, it stops the background file, plays the triggered file, and then resumes the background file right where it left off. And by using the fade parameter like no fade or fade time, that allows us to adjust how quickly it fades out or how quickly it fades back in the background mode. So we'll be looking at multi-random mode, background mode, as well as this fade time and also no fade. What no fade does is it basically, as it says, it just sets it to chop end and chop begin. So basically no fade, it just turns on and off. The fade timer by default, fade time by default is 5 seconds or 5,000 milliseconds. This number is in milliseconds. So if you wanted to fade in for 2 seconds and fade out for 2 seconds, you'd set it for 2,000. These little pound signs or hash marks at the beginning, every time I add one of those, that comments out the line. So in the case of multi-random and background mode, those modes are disabled in this config file right now because there is that hash mark or pound sign at the beginning. And also the no fade has that hash mark, as well as the fade time has the hash mark. So what this means, it'll be the default configuration. In other words, no multi-random mode, no background mode, and the fade time will be 5 seconds long. So our first experiment, or the first thing I want to show you, is I'm going to go ahead and remove that hash mark pound sign from the background mode. And then just to keep things nice and clean, I'm going to put a little tab in there to keep my pound signs lined up for my comments. Everything over to the right side is a comment pretty much explaining what that mode does. So if you ever have any questions, just open up this config file and you can look at it. So we're going to set background mode to on. Since I did not change the fade time or the no fade at all, this will be a 5-second fade. So what this is going to do is it's going to play the background track, continue it to loop, and then as soon as I get a trigger, it'll play the trigger. So I'm going to save this config file, exit it, and then we're going to pull our SD card out of our laptop, stick it into our Dream Player, turn on our power supply, and the first thing that will happen is it's going to start playing a background track. This is just a music track that I have loaded. We've got a couple of speakers attached to our Dream Player here, and remember the default fade is 5 seconds. So when I hit one of these triggers, you're going to hear it fade out for about 5 seconds.
Track 2, Part 1.
Plays our triggered input, and then now over 5 seconds we'll fade back into that background right where it left off. Turn the volume down a little bit. So this could be really useful. Think about a background sound like crickets, or a summer evening, or wind blowing, or birds chirping, seaside waves splashing, any of those kind of things. But somebody might, a truck might drive up, or a train might drive by and disturb somebody. And so we can actually have a trigger input, and then that would cause the event to happen.
Track 2, part 1.
And then it'll fade back into our background. And as I said before, those fade times are adjustable, so it's easy to change it if you don't want to use, in this case it was default to 5 seconds. The reason that it fades out the background track is that the Dream Player MK2 is not polyphonic, which means it can only play one thing at a time. In the future models like the Dream Player Pro, it will allow you to have a background track that continues to play while a trigger track plays on top of it and mixes together. The MK2 does not allow you to do that 2-track playback at the same time. If you wanted to do that, you'd use one of our mixers, either a passive mixer or an active mixer. This allows you to adjust the background level and then the trigger track level. So this is not intended to replace that kind of a setup. But if you want to have a background track with some triggers, this is actually really, really helpful. So we're going to go back in and edit our config file. And as you noticed, I had, it just triggered one track. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to comment out background mode, which turns it off, and I'm going to turn multi-random mode on. And what multi-random mode is going to do is this is going to let us play those 8 tracks within each of the triggers. So I turn multi-random mode on, I turn the background mode back off. We'll save that file, and I'll exit. Clear my browser out. Sorry, clear that. Pull my SD card back out. We'll throw it back in the Dream Player. Now this will demonstrate no background track. Realize I didn't remove any of the files, so that background track is still sitting on the card, but it's not going to play because I disabled that function in the config file. So now for my trigger board, I've got my 4 buttons. I'm going to hit trigger number 1, and it's going to pick randomly from 8 tracks, and they're called track number 1, part 1 through part 8. So
track 1, part 4.
So in that case, it picked number 4.
Track 1, part 6.
So it went 4, 6.
Track 1, part 7.
4, 6, 7.
Track 1, part 3.
Part 3. So it'll just keep looping around, and each time it finishes playing all 8 of those tracks, in this case I've got it loaded with 8, it'll actually reshuffle the tracks so that they go in a different order. And each of the trigger inputs actually has
track
a different...
3, part 3.
Has a different bank of...
Track 2, part 6.
Has a different bank of random tracks that it can play through. And you can load those. There could be 2 tracks on each of the triggers. There could be 1 on the first one, 3 on the second one, 6 on the third one, 8 on the fourth one. It could be pretty much anything that you want. Now to make things really a lot more exciting, what we're going to do is we're going to turn on the random mode, multi-random mode, at the same time as we're using the background track mode. And I'm also going to show you how we number and name those background tracks and the track numbers, just to help you understand that. So I'm looking at my tracks here. At the beginning I've got a track that's called 0-March of the Clouds. That 0 is what tells it that that's my background track. So a 0 track is a background track. Anything that begins with a 1 is associated with my trigger input number 1. Anything that starts with a 2 is associated with my trigger input number 2. And as you can see, I've got them numbered like track 1, track 1, 2, track 2, 2, track 2, part 1, part 2. So I've got a lot of different naming here. Those are all just for my convenience. The Dream Player is really just going to look at that first number, so this 1 in this case means track 1. And you can name them anything after that, it's just going to shuffle them. One important thing to note is it does have to have that hyphen, the dash sign or minus sign. So 1 dash could also be 1 space, but there has to be a delimiter, a character there. It can't just be 1 track, it has to be 1 dash track. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, those are my 4 random triggers, plus 0, which is my background track. And I'm going to go down and edit that config file yet again. And now I'm going to turn back on that background mode. So now I've got multi-random mode as well as background mode. And just for fun, I'm going to make it no fade. So this will be, instead of fading out for the 5 seconds, it's actually going to fade, in 0 seconds. Or in other words, just jump right from one track to the next. So I've got multi-random mode on, background mode on, and no fade. All three of those are on at the same time. So we'll close this out, take our SD card back out again. And this is really convenient because you can actually just load those files on the SD card, play around with the config file, and not have to copy a bunch of files on and off. I'm editing the config file right on the SD card. So since we have our background track there and I turn background mode on, we can hear the background track start looping. I'm going to
Track
trigger
1, Part 5. Track 1, Part 7. Track 1, Part 8. Track 3, Part 6. Track 3, Part 8. Track 2, Part 6. Track 4, Part 8.
So you can tell with the music it's maybe a little bit obnoxious having a zero fade like that or no fade like that. But if it was something else, something like crickets or something like that, it might not be quite so obnoxious. But we could set that fade time to be something different. I didn't really like the way that sounded. It didn't come back into the background track very nicely. So I'm going to go back in and actually edit that config file and change it to something more interesting. So instead of no fade, let's go and change this to something like maybe 1 second, or actually 500. Well, let's make it a half second. That might be interesting. Change it to a half second. So 500 milliseconds or 0.5 seconds. If you got all that, we're going to pop that card back out, put it back in. This is where it can be actually pretty fun. You don't have to mess around with an audio editor or anything. You can literally just play with that config file. So there's our background track again. Now it'll fade out in a half second.
Track 2, Part 4.
I like that a lot better.
Track 2, Part 1.
Comes in a lot smoother rather than being just like a popping back on.
Track 2, Part 2. Track 3, Part 6. Track 4, Part 4.
So that gives you some ideas about what you can do with the multi-random mode as well as the background track mode. Just remember to number your tracks properly. So the 0 track is your background track. Any one of the other triggers can be accessed by just putting that number at the beginning of the file name. So here again in our example we've got 1 is for track 1, so I just named it track 1 part 4, and track 1 part 5. But each one of these is it knows what trigger it's associated with by the number at the beginning, and then we've got our config file we can go and edit, and I can put everything back and I can play around with everything just by adding and removing those hash marks or the pound signs. So that's a quick overview of how this works. Hopefully that gives you a good idea of what you can do with the Dream Player MK2 by simply editing the config file and using some of the new features of firmware version 1.6. All the firmware updates are free on our website, www.PRICOM.com, and you can download that firmware, put it on your SD card, and update your player very easily. So keep the ideas coming to us. We're going to keep on adding new features. One of the nice things about this is you can easily and quickly change the configuration, and the configuration stays on the card. So if you replace the player, configuration stays with the card, not with the player. So thank you for joining, and keep looking at our website for new products.